Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, From Cradle to Grave, Use Data to More Effectively Manage Your Facilities Lifecycle. I'm Jennifer Getz, the Editorial Director of Facility Executive Magazine, and this webinar is presented by AkitaBox. Now I'll introduce your speakers for this panel discussion. Josh Lau is co-founder and Chief Solutions Engineer for AkitaBox. With more than 15 years of experience in the facility management industry, he is passionate about helping AEC firms, building owners, and facility management professionals make data-driven decisions that impact operational efficiency and success. Ron Crumps is a tested and proven facilities leader with 28 years of successful experience managing large, complex DoD and K-12 projects and facilities. Professional engineer and gifted communicator, Ron is experienced in construction, facilities, and contingency management, and in leading large teams delivering facility solutions. Ron's focus is on excellence in facilities leadership and management. Nick Getene is the Vice President of Operations for Hines Building Maintenance, HBM. He has more than 20 years of experience in facilities maintenance and management. As Vice President of Operations at HBM, Nick works with clients to ensure the successful implementation of their preventative maintenance programs. Before Hines Building Maintenance, he was the Director of Facilities and Facilities Manager at the International School of the Peninsula. Gentlemen, thank you for being here with us today.
Sure thing. Sure thing.
Thank
Glad
you
to be
so
here.
much for the intros. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate Ron and Nick joining us today for the conversation. We're going to lead this through a few different steps here as we go through, starting really with the status quo and what's really happening today and how are those challenges affecting us moving forward is what we're going to explore next. And so with that, Ron, I'm going to start with you, and you do a lot of work with facilities at Alpha. How would you describe the state of facility data today?
Well, it's pretty weak state as we interact with our clients. They're looking for good data about the condition of their facilities and the inventories of what they own. And most of the time, we don't see good data sets, and a lot of times we don't see good software tools to be able to store that data. So a lot of times you'd be surprised. Some of the bigger clients you'd expect would have software platforms, and they don't. So they're storing data on spreadsheets, and we'll talk about probably a little bit later. But then there's a tough handover when things are in spreadsheets and someone's private network or what have you. So we don't see the kind of the data that we'd expect to see with the life and the transferability that we'd like to see, both on the capital side and on the the kind of equipment inventory side. So that's my perspective on it.
Nick, same question to you. Are you seeing the same thing? And then on top of that, when you're talking about data and you bring up life cycle data and facility life cycle data, are you getting the same lack of data? And then what do they think of when you bring that up?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all over the place, right? Technology platforms are really advancing, so the expectation of data, of what it is or what it can do, that's rapidly changing. It wasn't that long ago that most of our clients they would get the data, it would be hand over, and then repeat every 5 years. I think we're really starting to see the desire for that to change, but the management is where I really agree with Ron. In between those professional assessments is really kind of where we need to bridge the gap. And ultimately, what people perceive it as, again, I think is contingent, but it's largely viewed as a capital replacement plan for repair. Sorry, I think I'm.
No, you're good. I'm gonna stick with you for a second here and have you expand a little bit on something that I hear a lot, and Ron said it earlier and you said it again now, which is talking about handover. And before I kick it over, I'll add a little flavor to this maybe, in the fact that what we're seeing out there in the industry, and especially when I'm out talking to owners and the AEC market at large, is that we're still seeing this, I'll say, want for a new turnover, but we're still stuck in this cyclical nature of I buy good data today, and at some point it becomes completely invaluable, and then I go buy more data. Is that the experience that you're seeing in that handover process? Are you seeing anything today that's showing us that we're changing, or are you pretty much seeing that across the board?
I would say to the degree I see a client using a good capital planning software, some sort of good capital planning software, they're able to keep that data alive and refreshed, or at least try to. And intuitively, what we're talking about here is a matrix of data, right? So you've got your facilities kind of on one side of the matrix, and all the different systems in your facilities by uniformat or by master format, however it's sorted. And then year by year across the top, what's the remaining service life of each of those systems, and when it ages out, and what it's going to cost to replace it. So I mean, that's the basic framework of what you're looking for. And to the degree a client has a good capital planning kind of mindset, and a good capital planning plan, I guess you might call it, they'll have a better outcome, and they're able to just keep refreshing that data. But that takes work, and that takes vision to know that that's important, and it takes work to keep that data current. So.
Sure. Nick, anything you have to add to that?
I believe we may have lost Nick
Oh,
for
did
a
we
moment.
lose Nick? Sorry, I can't see his camera here. So we'll keep moving, and if he joins us, just let me know, and we'll go from there. It's interesting, Ron, as we go through this, and I talk to people about the status quo, and pretty soon we're going to transition the conversation here. But we talk about the cyclical nature. We talk about this data handover process, and you talked about the mindset. What do you see? And it's always interesting. Is there any commonality in the owners or clients that you're talking to that are more likely to have that mindset, or is it simply kind of down to the individual and whether or not you're not seeing something by industry per se or region? It's down to the individual. Is there any commonality there that you're seeing in the types of clients that tend to be better at that capital planning mindset?
That's a really good question, because I think we had a pretty good mindset where I once worked, and where and that was a pretty large school district. I worked at a large school district for a number of years, but I've seen it's kind of a phenomenon that pops up in different places, where it could be sort of a more medium-sized school district where there's just a guy or gal that just gets it. And so I've seen it in a medium-sized school district, and I've seen it in a small school district, where for some reason they definitely have the interest of their business officials, or the input of their business officials. So they've got a good relationship with their business officials, and they kind of have this mindset about, hey, I'm responsible for these facilities. I'm responsible for the resources to keep them going. And when we start talking about capital planning, they just light up, and they kind of get it. And I'm trying to think through what are the commonalities there. If I think of any, I'll tell you, because we're always on the lookout, because we're developing and delivering services, and in some cases it seems like you get to a stopping point, and in other cases you've got this more engaged individual, and the conversation continues because they're interested about keeping the data current and really using it through the life cycle of their systems. And that's very encouraging.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I always ask because I still haven't had anybody have a really good answer for that yet, because I think it's a little bit of, they just pop up all over, and it's kind of this nice, refreshing conversation to have. But I would agree. I haven't found any clear commonalities yet, but I was seeing if maybe you had some insight that we haven't seen yet.
It's definitely born out of an understanding of asset management, though, I think, where an individual or their organization gets it that, they're stewarding this inventory of facilities that have a lot of value, and that those assets, those facility assets, are meant to do something with, and they're meant to fulfill their mission, whether it's education or it's retail or commercial or whatever it is. And so they kind of get it that these assets are important. I'm supposed to do something with these, and that's got to continue, right? And so the idea of capital planning just works for them, because they know, hey, I'm going to make this work long term. So
awesome.
Yeah.
We're going to transition the conversation here a little bit, and before we do and really dig in, we'd like to move on to a poll question and get some feedback from the audience before we get going.
So how confident are you in your facility's life cycle data? You have about 30 seconds to respond.
Well, they're voting, Ron. I mean, where do you think this one's going to come in? I can tell you from experience, I get very few hands when I ask people if they'd place bets on their facility data being correct.
Yeah, I think it'll be between not at all and somewhat, I would think. And then the next question. Okay, yeah.
Well, we had a few varies.
Yeah,
that's good. It's something that we don't see that often. I would agree. I think not at all and somewhat is where we thought it was. It's definitely the majority there. Coming in at 88% if my math is right. So
if they can put their hands on that, that matrix, if you will, that's what they're mentally thinking through. Those data cells and those data elements. Where's that data?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the remaining service life, life cycle and cost at the end of the life cycle. That's really what we're asking. Can you put your hands on that data?
We're going to talk about everything in the kitchen sink next. You've seen some of these RFPs lately, and how I'll call them aspirational. They are, but there's implications for how aspirational some are and how much they want in one solution, in one, sweep of the facilities. And so I have my kind of predisposed opinions of why people are kind of requesting everything and the kitchen sink. What are you seeing out there? Are you seeing this trend right now of kind of, hey, we just need everything? And in a lot of cases, it results in things not going forward because it was way more expensive or having to rebid and things like that. Is that a trend that you're seeing in the market right now?
I don't know. I think it has a lot to do with who they've been talking to and what sort of vision they have to begin with, because we like to use and some of the leadership in Alpha are really good about this, a crawl, walk, run kind of mindset. And so, but it's easy when you're interacting with the client to talk about running, and oh, you could do this and you could do this and you can do this and you can do this, and here's how you do this and here's how you do this and this, etc. And you simply have to recognize that, as we've already kind of touched on, different clients are in different phases of that development, if you will, where in some cases, the best counsel for them, what they really need to hear is, well, what would it take to start crawling toward a preventative maintenance program and a capital maintenance program? And then are you ready to jump to the next phase of walk and then run? And probably, at least in some cases, they hear about solutions, good solutions and platforms that have all those capabilities. And they kind of catch on and they get a vision for, oh, wouldn't it be great if we had all those tools and all those capabilities and they're all integrated. And so, and that's good that they have that vision and they have that idea, but maybe they're not quite ready for all of that. So I think that's part of it. And to the degree they're waking up to the need for all that, that's great. But at some point, maybe those of us who interact with the software and the data can kind of come in and say, got it, and we want to help you develop this at one stage at a time, so it becomes an exercise in prioritizing where to start first. We want to get you crawling and then walking and then eventually running. But of course there's a temptation just to, buy the whole enchilada.
Let's dig into that a little, and a few places that I'd like to dig into specifically. I agree. I mean, walk, crawl, run, right? Or crawl, walk, run. Sorry, I had those backwards. It is the right way to do it. I guess the question that I have in that, and, from your experience working with owners, and I know you all do negotiated work and respond to RFPs, and you probably read a lot of RFPs. When I read through RFPs a lot of times, and this happens in the industry, especially when you get into like public sector, hey, one municipality or state or county wrote a really good RFP and it kind of gets circulated, and maybe that RFP is everything in the kitchen sink and it gets added to, and then that gets shared. And at some point it's this like conglomeration of, you can kind of see 3 or 4 different approaches in a single RFP. And the reality is they have to go out to bid. I would always suggest, when possible, things like this, when we get into capital planning and FCAs, to really get alignment, you should really work with somebody, to build that strategy. If you have to go to RFP, to build that RFP out, to make sure you're really aligning with what your priorities are and what you expect your spend to be, because there's very different ends of that ratio. How do you suggest, owners start to approach that, if they don't have the ability to negotiate this work with a trusted advisor, and they have to write the RFP? How do you suggest they approach that kind of prioritization, and how do we know what to put in the RFP and what to ask for, so that we're getting apples to apples and all of those types of things? Where do you suggest an owner start in that process?
Well, that's a good question. I think they have to start just in thinking through the maturity of their organization. I think there's some basic things, there's some basic blocking and tackling that they've got to get down. They've got to have a good inventory of what they own, and collecting all that is a priority, I think. And they've got to think about how ready are they to take the next step into preventative maintenance programs and then capital planning programs. I think in that order. It might vary depending on the client, but I just think they need to think about their maturity in thinking through those issues. Do I have a good handle on what I own? Am I constantly reacting because I don't really understand what I own or have a good handle on that? And they can start there, asset inventory kind of stuff. And then right on the heels of that is preventative maintenance, I think. And then right on the heels of that is capital planning, I think. But again, the temptation is, well, you sort of need it all. And so hence the temptation to get into the whole kitchen sink again. But I think a good inventory and a preventative maintenance program is super critical. You think about it. I was just talking about it actually in a conference. Preventative maintenance is all about having your facilities available today and tomorrow. So it's about preventing downtime, because you're taking care, you're changing your oil, and that's making sure your engine doesn't seize. And then, but the life cycle of that engine assumes you're going to change the oil every 5 or 10,000, right? And so you're doing the PMs to make sure you realize the full life cycle of that piece of equipment. And so to me, a preventative maintenance program is just worth its weight in gold. And so that's the next logical step. I hope this is making sense, but I think an organization just needs to take a look at where are they at maturity wise, and also their staffing has something to do with it too. If they're primarily in-house staff, I think of course they have more control. if it's outsourced, then they've got to, take that into consideration too.
Yeah, no, you're tracking right on. It's interesting. You talk about the order of things and the value of a preventative maintenance program. Um, I, I always the conversation about PM comes up a lot when I'm out talking to folks, and one of the things, and you brought it up earlier when we were talking about the status quo and the value of building things, and you landed a really good point about how no matter what you're doing, it needs to align to your business goals. And when we talk about different facilities and how the facility supports business goals in different ways, in different verticals. Manufacturing, a lot of times the building isn't all that complicated, but boy, it's holding a lot of really expensive equipment underneath it. And so we prioritize things like roofs, because we're just trying to keep things dry because the building isn't doing much other than keeping things dry, to healthcare, where our assets are literally keeping people alive. And so when we look at that and you start to look at that range in terms of how a facility is truly supporting the business needs of that organization, are there any general, guidance or, words of wisdom you can share in terms of, how do you start to focus and prioritize? Because even when we talk about a PM system, I've met very few. I have met a few fully funded facilities groups, but very few, right? It's a unicorn in the group.
Right.
Most of them are understaffed and underfunded. And so you have to have those real conversations about priorities, and is this a run to failure item versus I actually have staff to PM this and perform an effective PM program to maintain the life cycle of something that truly does support the business need. Any words of wisdom around how to even start that process, or defining, what is important and a priority to you and your organization from a facility side?
So it sounds like you've been in ISO 55000. You've been in the International Standards Organization on Strategic Asset Management. You've been reading about strategic asset management. That's what you're talking about, really. ISO 55000 is the international standard on asset management, and it talks all about strategic asset management, which in a nutshell is aligning the facility goals with the organizational goals. And the very first step is creating policy and vision kind of documents that express this alignment in one way or another. So I think what I would say is you got to be sitting down with your business officials and with your operations officials, with your product line officials, and saying, what's important to you? I need to understand what's important to you. We can't just assume that the facilities guys understand what's most important to their real clients, the people who are trying to operate the facilities. I think you start there. Make sure you understand those priorities and get that alignment of your facilities to your organizational goals. And it's, in a K-12 setting, it's the superintendent and the business officials and the chief academic officer and people like that. And it's different individuals in the different verticals, but that's where you start. And then right after that, you start talking about levels of service, making sure that your levels of service meet the needs of your client, of your occupants, of your tenants, what have you. So what kind of levels of service do you need in maintenance? What kind of levels of service do you need in custodial? What kind of levels of service do you need for pest control or whatever? So it starts with that dialogue with your primary customer. I hope that's helping.
No, that was exactly where I wanted you to go with it. So I appreciate the insights and input there. I agree. That's exactly the road that I wanted you to go down. So I appreciate your expertise on that.
Oh, sure. I've learned a lot too from the American Public Works Association. A plug for, a shameless plug for another organization. They have a really good asset management roadmap that's really easy to find on Google it. APWA Asset Management Roadmap, and that it just helps frame these kind of conversations and what facility managers should be thinking about as they're thinking about that alignment and where do I go next. You know, starts with policy, the levels of service, and then asset inventory, et cetera. And so they lay that out, and it's really helpful. So I commend that.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing the resource. I mean, it's about bringing those resources to light so that people know they're there. There's a lot of good information out. Sometimes people just need to be pointed in the right direction. So really appreciate that. We're gonna keep moving here. Before we move on to really looking ahead and talking about the future, another quick poll to understand where you guys are at.
Do you have enough facility condition data to support your capital planning? No, somewhat, or yes. You have about 30 seconds to respond.
Ron, this is another interesting question, Ron, because honestly, I think it's going to depend on when their last FCA was for them to answer that. I think people that had a recent one may be a little more higher on that, and if they haven't had one in a while, maybe lower. So I'd be curious. I know we don't have a follow-up question, but it'd be interesting to see where that's at.
Look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. So most of them are somewhere in the middle. So that means they're after 2 years out from an FCA waiting for another one. I think is what that story is telling us potentially. Thoughts?
Well, when you think about facility data, you know, there's facility data that is static and unchanging, if you will, like make, model, serial number, install date, things like that. You know, the attributes of some of your equipment and when was the roof installed, things like that. So those data pieces are static and enduring, and so maybe they don't need so much in terms of updates. But then when you think about condition data, well, that's contingent or dependent on other things. It's dependent on a few key things, I think, because the question is, you know, if you gather condition data, why does that need to be updated? Isn't that, you know, don't you do it just once? Well, it's dependent upon your preventative maintenance program. So if you get condition data on some equipment and then don't do the PMs, well, that's going to have a dramatic effect on the life cycle, the remaining service life of that piece of equipment. If you're doing, and how completely and regularly are you doing the PMs? It's going to depend on the use patterns of that equipment. You know, if you start using the equipment a third more or a half more or less or what have you, that's going to adjust that remaining service life just based on the use patterns. Or maybe it's how, you know, how the tenants are using it or whatever it is. It can depend a little bit on the weather. That's not probably as significant of a factor. But the point is that the condition data is more dependent than independent, if you will.
Sure.
And so, you know, if that makes sense, I think. And so that's the case for refreshing that condition data every 3 to 5 years, something like that. So
I'm going to transition us a little bit and kind of point the arrow towards the future and really talk about, you know, what we all want to be talking about, which is, you know, how do we move away from this cyclical nature that is planning for this stuff and really start moving towards, you know, that ongoing part. I constantly, you know, we talk about stewardship of facility data. We talk about the ability to have, you know, that single source of truth, transparency and defensibility. All of those things come to mind when I talk about the future. And, you know, we're thinking about these kind of, now we are kind of looking at everything in the kitchen sink, right? Because this is a little bit aspirational for some people, and other people are on the edge of this and ready for it today. And I always like to have the conversation, because for those of you that this is aspirational for, how do you start? Because the longer you wait, believe it or not, you're exponentially getting behind because of the value of the data that you're creating in your lake to draw from in the future. Not collecting data in a standardized format that you can start to look at and trend on, you're actually falling further behind than just kind of a one-to-one, year-to-year at this point. And so really like to have this for A, those people that it's aspirational. How do you start to get that foundation? And then B, for those of you that this is kind of, you're on the doorstep, you're ready to step into this. What are the things you should look for? What are the value points? What are the key features and attributes that are going to help you move forward now that you do have that baseline data and are ready to take that next step? And so, with that, Ron, what does it mean to you to kind of look forward, and it's no longer just, hey, one and done, but whether it's the owner with partnership with somebody like yourself and your firm, maintaining that data or helping them keep it up to date. What does that look like for you? What does stewardship look like and maintenance look like from a data standpoint to you?
I think in an organization, I always found it helpful, first of all, to assign people specific responsibilities for data, which might seem strange, but a lead data manager, if you will. I designated a person who is the lead data manager, and they happened to be very interested in data, but they knew that they were responsible for keeping that data current, and everybody knew that they were responsible for keeping that data current. Everybody had everyone had a role, everybody had a part in supporting that data set, but there was one person who was overall responsible for that, and they owned the inventory data and the capital planning data, and that just seemed to help out a lot. And then it's just day by day showing people and demonstrating to people how that data is used to create information, right? Data is just a number, information is what that tells you and how you use it, but it's opening people's eyes on a day-to-day basis to how that data is used. So it's showing them where in the processes the data is used and how the processes are data driven. And I'll keep thinking about that.
Yeah.
Where I would start.
Talking about the future and looking at these things, a lot of times I walk in and, you see solutions out there, you look at things and you're like, yeah, that's really good, but boy, it just seems like you're using averages of averages and it's not really my data. So I'm planning based upon, some square footage stuff. And also, maybe I'm looking at just age, right? Maybe I'm looking at something else. I think the fear of moving too far into the future too fast is that we lean too much on data sets and start to devalue that expertise that, frankly, Ron, your entire team brings to a project. How do we balance these things moving into the future? Because we frankly don't have enough good data today to only rely upon the data. We have to rely on our experts, and a lot of that's very subjective. I mean, think about it from the standpoint of, and I see things now even where they're selling, hey, look, we can bring all this data together and we're going to give you everything in a 3D virtual tour so that you can perform a virtual FCA. And I come from the construction industry, and I can tell you, walking through and doing an FCA, there's a huge difference in looking at a photo and standing there and feeling how humid it is in that room, or hearing how that engine isn't clicking right, or there's something wrong with the freak drive. Like, those things are very tactile.
Right.
In a way, and sure, we can censor everything, we can do all that, but we're years away from that even in itself. And so how do we do this balance moving forward? Because we tend to look at the future and go, it's automated, but in reality, I don't think that's the case, or shouldn't be, at least, to get the maximum value out of your tools.
Yeah, not entirely automated. I agree with you. I think there's a lot of value in explaining to your organization what asset management is about, and how facility asset management, and how you have to delegate, you have to delegate responsibility to individuals and explain to them, hey, you are responsible for these systems in our facilities. You're the asset manager for these systems. So you got to own the inventory of what you own. You know, you got to know the inventory of what you own, the condition of what you own, the life cycle of what you own, what it costs to maintain what you own, what it costs to replace what you own. You're the life cycle owner steward of this subset of the assets. And then you turn to the next guy and you say the same thing. And there's different ways to kind of split that up. I guess it could be by regional, or it could be you've got this facility, or if you have a fairly consolidated inventory, then it's, hey, you've got all the HVAC and you've got all the electrical distribution, et cetera. And I think that can be very helpful, because then that individual, so that's the balance. That individual, applies his or her brain power, and they know they're responsible for those assets. And now they're thinking about, what data do I need to manage those assets? And do I understand the life cycle, and where is that life cycle data? So I think that's a place to start. But I also think it's very important to have the conversations about how the data is used and how data helps us make decisions. So we collect data sets, right, to help us make better decisions, and someday, as you pointed out, to automate decisions so that we don't have to make them. A fresh air makeup is a good example. Years ago, we said, open a window, it's stuffy in here. Now, the carbon dioxide detector says it's above 1,000 parts per million. I need to let in some fresh air, or whatever. And so there's a lot of power in the automation of systems, so that frees us up to do other things, make other decisions, more important decisions. And so you have to keep having those conversations, kind of opening people's eyes to how that data is very useful, and how automation is very useful, and how automation makes our lives easier, as long as there's good programming into the organization. It's a smart building, but it's only as smart as the smarts that we programmed into it, at least for now.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I'm gonna keep us moving here so we can leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end when we get there. But kind of, last section here before we kind of do some parting shots and Q&A, trust but verify, right? And so, some of this stuff is, and I talked about kind of like the automation or sensor data, or whatever it might be. And I think it's kind of playing both of those things, right? We talk about leveraging real-time data with boots on the ground, but really this comes into, how do we blend people and technology in a way that adds value to the process and doesn't cause more problems in the rollout? I mean, change management is huge in this industry. Frankly, it's one of the last pieces of, if you look at the design, construction, and operations side, it's really one of the last pieces to get tech savvy. And so when we start to blend these things, it has to be seamless, right? It has to feel like we're not intruding with technology, but technology is simply adding more information. And you brought it up earlier in automation. It's freeing you up to do the non-monotonous things that take real brain power and skill, and all of those types of things, and kind of the monotonous things of like, hey, go read this meter, go do this, because we need those readings. Let's automate those things, and then blend it together in some way, shape, or form. And so with that in mind, I'll kind of flip this a little bit from, we've been talking about all the things to do, but let's talk about this in terms of the barriers that are there today, from what you're seeing out in the world, when you go out and do this. How close do you think facility owners are, and not just the owners, because I think the owners are maybe more ready than the infrastructure would allow for, but how ready is the building, and how ready are the technicians for this type of approach, where we're really taking it to that next level, and we're we're really kind of automating things based upon data, but yet they're going to have to go take action based upon that. And so, hey, something comes in and this is out of whack, it's going to deploy somebody now. That boots on the ground now has to work with that technology that's basically now telling them what is most important to do next. How ready do you think the industry is for that? And specifically the people, not necessarily the C-suite who's looking at this from a data perspective, but the boots on the ground is the one who have to interact with the technology on a daily basis. How close do you think we are to that?
That's a really good question. I'm struggling with an answer. I think I think they're ready. I think they want to use the technology. I'm thinking of our controls technology, automation for HVAC. They want to know that we've got a good handle on the conditions of the facilities and the indoor air quality conditions. And so I think they're ready. I think I'm thinking of drones. I'm sorry, but I'm thinking of the interaction between technology and boots on the ground. Right? There's got to be this understanding of what the technology is good for and what it's useful for, and as much as you can, kind of how it works. But then there's got to be the reality check, the trust but verify, the owner operator who understands how that thing functions and what it's good for. But I think people are right.
I mean, let's drill into drones for a second. You brought it up. I like the topic because I always think it's interesting. One of the big places that I see drones, kind of sold on projects for is, get to the places more safely, which there absolutely are, right? I mean, I've seen use cases where they're doing it on, clay tile roofing systems to identify where you're not going to get up and walk that. It gets pretty dangerous and gnarly. And so that's a great use case. Yep. Flip side of it is we have a flat roof. We fly the drone on it. I mean, sure, it may show me something, but like there's the tactile side of me actually putting my weight on it and feeling what's under my feet that a drone can't detect, that I can deflect the roof by 6 inches when I step in these areas, which means I have some sublayer issues that there's no way that a drone's going to detect that. And so talk about that a little bit and that blend and understanding again, what it can do and can't do in the right use cases.
Right. So, if you tried to explain to a client that they paid you to do a condition assessment and you told them, well, I just went and looked at it, they would say, what? That's all you did? Because really, we all know that, there's look, listen, feel, smell, touch, there's the tangible kind of aspects that you're talking about. And so I think there's considerable value in applying those other senses to an assessment, just exactly like you're talking about. However, in some applications, as you just said, like where something's very dangerous or you have to cover a lot of horizontal in a quick period of time, and it's it's pavement or something that you can get a pretty good sense for where the trouble spots are just visually.
Sure.
There's good applications for that, but you just learn a lot more from being there when you can be there, because you can smell something going on, you can hear something going on, you can see some vibration. You just learn things from being there that you can't learn from just looking through a camera.
So great points.
But the same thing applies to other technology. So there's people who have the gift of understanding how it's useful, how that kind of technology is useful, and being able to employ it in the most effective way. But we're learning. We've got to learn more about how to employ it. But I've seen some presentations that pretty much highlighted these things. We're saying, oh, they could get to this spot that nobody else could get. That's great. And they could get this, over this large horizontal area very quickly. But they couldn't read the nameplate or whatever, at least not yet. And there were things that they couldn't understand through just a camera.
Sure. I'm going to move on to our last slide here, which is really focused on takeaways, but I'll hover here and let people look at this as maybe they think of some questions that they might have here in a minute. we talked through a bunch of stuff. You know, there's some things that definitely came out of the conversation that to me we should, you know, re-highlight, right? Which is, you know, prioritize based upon your business, right? So focus in on where your business value, how the facilities support that business value, and then, you know, prioritize things based upon that. You know, we touched on the technology, some other things. Ron, any kind of, you know, parting wisdom, or just, you know, hey, if you took anything away from today, here's what I think you should at least focus on or should stick with you. Um, Anything kind of on the way out here that you want to make sure people got and understood as part of the conversation?
I think we've been talking about facility asset management the whole time. I've been thinking we've been talking about being a responsible owner, which is understanding what you own and condition data and capital planning data. We've been talking about that the whole time. I think the crawl, walk, run is an important takeaway, where an organization needs to kind of self-assess and not bite off too much, but have a progression towards where they want to go and where they want to get to, and then prioritizing how they start taking one bite at a time out of getting there. And then I think, as you already pointed out, I think this idea of alignment of organizational mission and facility purpose and facility goals is really important. You got to understand what you're there for, and that's going to drive. So that, you know, so that's a mindset, right? That's going to create a tool set. That's going to create a skill set. It sounds corny, but you know, you're talking about this powerful triumvirate, really, of if you have the right mindset, that's going to drive you to find tools to do what you know you need to do, and you're using those tools, and then that's developing in you a skill set for doing this kind of work that just reinforces the mindset, and it just keeps going perpetually. So
awesome. No, I think that's a great parting words there before we get into Q&A. Again, thanks everybody for joining today, and you know, we'll leave it here. There's a QR code people can scan, and then some other things you can get to via the link. Any questions coming in yet?
Yes, so thank you both for this presentation, and thank you to all attendees for sending in questions. You know, please continue to submit any questions that you may have. Okay, so to start, what are the first steps for evaluating the quality of my facility data?
Ron, I'll kick that to you.
okay. The first steps for evaluating the quality of my facility data. Let's see, I think it would be figuring out how expansive it is. If you have a good idea of the size of your facility inventory, you know, understanding how complete is the data would be a starting point. I think another starting point, though, would be kind of deciding what are the key attributes that you want to have. And so, you know, you got to have make, model, serial number, basic information about your equipment inventory. And, you know, to the degree you have that, and is that data in a format that appears to be consistent? Is a rooftop unit, or is it called three different things? Is there consistency in the naming of the data? So those are some thoughts.
Yeah, I would add on to that too, Ron. The idea of spot checking has been one that we've used in the past, whether it be, hey, let's go take this small building. It's a sample of what we have because we have 100 of them. Or, hey, let's go check these main mechanical rooms and, you know, make sure everything's identified. Because, hey, if you walk into a mechanical room and you can only find 50% of the things in your system, that may be telling a larger story. And so those are just the types of things, you know, if you just want to start, and part of it is, did you inherit it or is it yours? A lot of times I hear people that inherit data sets. And in that case, the first step might truly be doing a full audit to figure out where you're at. But even that can be done in bite-sized chunks just to see if, hey, nope, it was pretty good, we don't need to keep doing this, or wow, that was bad. Let's keep going and see how it goes.
No, in the age of the data, you know, data can have a shelf life, some of it, you know, depending on the elements, as we talked about.
Yeah, good point.
Absolutely perfect. Another question we have here is who should be the key stakeholders when it comes to life cycle data?
But
It depends on what the life cycle data is, whether, is it asset life cycle data? Um,
the first thing
I
that
guess,
came to my mind was the maintainer who's got to manage it. You know,
yeah, CFO is always, who's the money person who's got to do budgeting, is another big stakeholder there.
yeah,
But
that's
frankly, a stakeholder that I think is left out a lot is the technician themselves.
yeah.
Um, Ron, I'm sure you're very familiar and you do it all the time. Hey, you're called in to go look at a building for the first time. I'd be surprised if part of your process wasn't interviewing the folks who interact with that building the most and asking them what keeps them up at night.
That's always we
In a
always
lot of cases, they're kept out of the conversation.
yeah, and they're the ones that have to live with it, right? I mean, they have to live with the the misunderstanding of the life cycle of this thing. And now I'm using duct tape, or whatever, poor analogy, but I'm trying to keep this thing limping along when it's 10 years past the end of its life. So the
Yep.
guy who's got to live with it is a key stakeholder.
Yeah.
And then the engineering staff who's got to replace it, they have absolutely got to be involved in understanding the life cycles of this equipment so they can be on tap. But I think it's helpful if your organization is large enough to have some sort of capital planning manager whose full-time job is to just understand the life cycle of the equipment and when it's got to be replaced. He's not the maintainer. He's going to interact with the maintainers all the time because they really have the best data day to day. But he's just doing that planning to forecast when things need to be replaced.
Perfect. So I believe we have time for maybe one more question. How do I get non-facility management roles invested in the value of facility management processes and technology?
Ooh, that's a good one. I'll kick that to you, Ron, while I think about it.
Can we say that? Can you ask me that one more time? How do you?
Oh, yes, of course. How do I get non-facility management roles invested in the value of facility management processes and technology?
Hmm. Ask them about their levels of what level of service they expect, and start to draw a tangible connection between what they expect and what you need to do to meet that expectation, and start to put some dollars and cents to that. I think it puts sense to it, as you start to put those things together and show that there's this tangible connection between your expectation of a level of service and what I can deliver based on what I'm funded and the staffing I have to try to achieve that. So that's a helpful way to start the dialogue, I think.
I think that's a great point. Nothing to add there.
And we do actually have one final question that we can also ask. How would you recommend getting data from vendors?
Like owners, I'm assuming when they say vendors, ask nicely and often. A lot of times, and I don't know, Ron, what your experience has been, but oftentimes we find that just having an on-site meeting to collect that data is a lot of times much more effective than the back and forth that happens through requests and emails.
Yeah, I think it's all about keeping good running long-term relationships with the vendors. The best vendors, want to keep a long-term relationship, and it's showing help. It's helping them understand why you need the data too. I mean, it's a continuous dialogue with them, I guess. That's a tough one to answer.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. It looks like we are out of time. Thank you for this panel discussion today, and to Akita Box for sponsoring this webinar. And of course, thank you to our audience for attending today. A recording from today's session will be made available on our magazine's website, facilityexecutive.com, and we will also be sending out a link. For more information, you can also go to akitabox.com. Thank you and have a great afternoon.